By the time she turned 20, Princess Kutalun owned 10,000 horses, but she didn't buy a single one of them. She won them. Every stallion in her herd represented a prince who thought he could overpower her, only to end up face down in the dirt. While other nobles in the 13th century were trading daughters for political alliances, Kutalun issued a terrifying public decree. She would marry any man who could beat her in a wrestling match. But if he lost, he owed her 100 horses. This wasn't a courtship, it was a harvest. Suitors traveled from the furthest corners of the Mongol Empire, confident that their size and royal training would overwhelm the daughter of Kaidu Khan. They would step into the dusty circle, muscles tense, surrounded by jeering soldiers. But Kutalun didn't just grapple. She moved with the fluid violence of an apex predator. Accounts from the era describe her snatching massive men and slamming them to the ground with such force that the impact silenced the crowd. One arrogant prince wagered 1,000 horses on a single bout. He left bankrupt, walking home while Kutalun added his wealth to her empire. But the wrestling ring was merely her training ground. Her true arena was the open war against her uncle, Kublai Khan. She didn't hide in a silk tent. She rode lead cavalry alongside her father. Marco Polo himself wrote that she would charge into the thickest clusters of enemy lines, snatch a captive right out of the saddle as easily as a hawk snatches a hare, and drag him back to her camp. She was a giant among men, physically and politically, the favorite child of the Khan who commanded the respect of the wildest army on earth. In a history written by conquerors, Kutalun refused to be conquered, living and dying as the undefeated moon of the Mongolian steppe.
The bullets didn't kill her, not at first. In the suffocating basement of the Ipatiev house, the executioners fired point blank into the smoke and screaming chaos. But the 17-year-old Grand Duchess Anastasia was still moving. It was July 1918, and the Bolshevik squad was terrified. The bullets seemed to ricochet off the young girl's chest as if she were protected by magic. It wasn't magic. It was 18 pounds of diamonds and pearls sewn into the lining of her corset to hide them from captors. That night, the jewels acted as armor, prolonging a brutal execution that should have ended in seconds. But as the bayonets finally descended to finish the job, a different kind of survival began. The chaos of that night was so absolute, so bloody, that the world refused to believe the Romanov line was truly extinguished. Rumors clawed their way out of the Ural mud. People whispered that a sympathetic guard had pulled a breathing Anastasia from the pile of bodies and carted her away into the dark Russian forest. For decades, this ghost story became history. Dozens of women emerged across Europe and America, broken and traumatized, claiming to be the lost princess. The most famous, Anna Anderson, spent 60 years fighting in courts and asylums, possessing an uncanny resemblance and knowledge of imperial secrets that no peasant should have known. She offered the world a fairy tale ending to a political massacre. But science is colder than memory. In 2007, amateur archaeologists discovered a second, smaller pit in the woods, separated from the main mass grave. Inside were 44 bone fragments. In a sterile, modern laboratory, high-powered microscopes and mitochondrial DNA analysis finally closed the book. The results were absolute. The fragments belonged to the missing Romanov children. There was no escape. No life in Virginia, no grandmother waiting in Paris. Anastasia died on that basement floor, a terrified teenager shielded briefly by her own inheritance before the darkness took her. The survivor was just a myth we invented because the truth was too heavy to carry.
She possessed the greatest empire on earth, yet she died in a room smaller than a servant's quarters. Joanna of Castile wasn't born the mad. In 1496, she is the golden child of the Renaissance, a vision of power riding a stallion through the sun-drenched courtyards of the Alhambra Palace.
Her auburn hair flows in the wind, her velvet gown catches the light, and the world is at her feet. She has a kingdom, a crown, and a husband, Philip the Handsome, whom she loves with a terrifying intensity. But passion in the Spanish court is a death sentence. Cut to 10 years later, the gold is gone. In the freezing heights of the Sierra Morena Mountains, a funeral procession halts in the snow. Joanna is no longer the vibrant archduchess. She is a gaunt, spectral figure in ragged black mourning weeds, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She isn't marching to war, she is guarding a corpse. She throws herself onto the lead-lined coffin of her husband, refusing to let the grave take him, screaming that he is only sleeping. The court calls it insanity. Her father, King Ferdinand, calls it opportunity. High above, looking down with cold, calculating eyes, Ferdinand and her own teenage son, the future Emperor Charles V, make a silent pact. They don't send doctors, they send guards. They drag the screaming queen to the castle of Tordesillas, shoving her into a bleak, circular room behind heavy oak doors. The lock clicks. It will not open again for 46 years. Decades bleed away. The vibrant girl becomes a ghost. An old woman with tangled white hair sits on the cold stone floor, staring blankly at a single shaft of dust dancing in the sunlight. Just beyond those iron bars, the Spanish Empire stretches across the globe, ruled by the men who stole her life. History remembers her as a madwoman. It should have remembered her as a prisoner.
They called her a curiosity, a savage wrapped in silk, but they never saw what she was hiding in her hand. While the history books would eventually flatten her lineage into a footnote, the reality of her life in England was a quiet war between two bloodlines. It began on a dock in Gravesend. The mist was heavy that morning, clinging to the rigging of a wooden ship bound for the colonies. But she wasn't on it. She was staying behind, watching the white cliffs of Dover swallow the last connection to her mother's world. Raised in the stone halls of a London manor, she became a master of camouflage. She wore the stiff, embroidered collars of the aristocracy, her dark hair pulled back tight, her copper skin dusted with powder to blend into the pale court of King James. But the architecture of her face told a story the English wanted to forget. To the noblemen whispering behind their fans, she was a symbol of a tamed empire. To the crown, she was political leverage. Yet, beneath the layers of heavy velvet and lace, she kept a rebellion alive. Hidden in the deep folds of her skirt was a small, rough pouch, buckskin and shell beads smelling of smoke and earth. Every time she curtsied to a duke or sat still for a portrait painter, her fingers traced the patterns on that pouch. It was her anchor. The manicured English gardens she walked through felt suffocating compared to the phantom memories of towering Virginia pines she had never seen, but somehow knew. They thought they had civilized her. They thought the savage was gone. But looking into her polished silver hand mirror, the reflection didn't show a proper English lady. For a split second, the candlelight would catch her eyes and the stiff collar would vanish, replaced by the regalia of a Powhatan princess. She was the bridge across the ocean, and the water never truly leaves the blood.
One pull of a trigger didn't just end a presidency, it executed an entire dynasty. Before the chaos erupted at Ford's Theatre, the name Booth was synonymous with American royalty. They were the undisputed kings of the stage, commanding standing ovations and worshipped by the masses. But in the single heartbeat it took for a velvet curtain to fall, that legacy was strangled. The morning after, the silence in their Baltimore home was louder than any cannon fire. Young Edwina sat paralyzed in the parlor, a room once filled with theatrical magic, now choking on the thick smell of burning paper. She watched her mother feed their history to the fireplace. Handwritten letters, glowing reviews, family memories, all fed to the flames in a desperate attempt to erase their connection to the monster. Venturing outside became a walk through hell. On the rainy cobblestone streets, the family had to glide like phantoms, hiding their faces behind heavy black veils. The same crowds that once threw flowers at their feet now whispered venom, their fingers pointing like daggers at the innocent relatives of a killer. They had fallen from the height of fame to the depths of national hatred overnight. Inside the dark sanctuary of his study, the famous Edwin Booth held a small, crumbling portrait of his brother. With a trembling hand, he locked it away in a heavy wooden chest, burying his love along with his grief. It was a funeral for the living. Years later, staring out at a monument dedicated to Lincoln, Edwina saw her reflection in the glass. But it wasn't just her face staring back. It was the flickering silhouette of the man who destroyed them, a ghost that refused to leave the stage. To be born a prince in Byzantium was not a blessing. It was a death sentence wrapped in purple silk. Behind the shimmering gold of the Hagia Sophia and the massive Theodosian walls, the great palace wasn't a home, it was a slaughterhouse. Imagine a 15-year-old boy, weighed down by a jewel-encrusted crown far too heavy for his neck. He sits on a golden throne, not playing at war, but boredly signing execution warrants with a stylus. He is surrounded by plotting eunuchs who whisper poison, calculating exactly when to strike. In this court, loyalty was repaid with a searing iron rod. The most common punishment wasn't execution, it was darkness. We see a loyal general having his eyes gouged out, simply for becoming too popular. We see a young rival prince strangled in the dungeon shadows because his bloodline was a threat. Survival meant becoming a monster. Take Justinian II. After his nose was slit to disqualify him from ruling, he didn't vanish. He returned wearing a golden mask to conceal the mutilation. He would laugh maniacally behind that metal face, while commanding guards to hurl citizens into the Bosporus. But the ultimate betrayal didn't come from a rival, it came from a mother. Empress Irene of Athens. She didn't protect her son, she coveted his throne. With a stoic, cold stare, she stood by as soldiers dragged her own flesh and blood to the purple chamber, the very room where he was born, to blind him so she could rule alone. This was the true cost of Byzantium, a legacy written not in laws, but in the blood of its children. When the imperial crown finally falls from a dead boy's head, shattering against the blood-stained marble, it breaks the illusion that divine right ever offered protection from human cruelty. Imagine being crowned before you even take your first breath. Most monarchs wait decades for the throne, serving as princes in the shadows. Alfonso XIII was born possessing it. Madrid, 1886. A golden cradle sits beneath a massive velvet canopy. The infant inside isn't surrounded by cooing relatives, but by kneeling generals and bishops, their heads bowed to a baby who can't yet lift his own. He was the delicate anchor for a fractured nation. His childhood was a performance. While other boys scraped their knees in parks, he marched across cold, polished marble floors in a miniature general's uniform. His only playmates were toy soldiers. His only audience, the stern gaze of his mother, Queen Regent Maria Cristina, and the looming oil portrait of a father he never met. He was raised to rule a world that was rapidly disappearing. That reality shattered on his wedding day. As the royal carriage processed through the sunlit streets, a bouquet of flowers was thrown from a balcony. It wasn't a gift, it was a bomb. Thick, white smoke instantly choked the air. The deafening roar silenced the celebration. When the haze cleared, the white rose petals paving the street had turned blood red. He emerged from the wreckage shaken but alive. Yet the omen was undeniable. The age of absolute reverence was dead. By April 1931, the cheers had turned to jeers. The streets of Madrid roared for a republic. The king, now an aging man with heavy eyes, boarded a train in the dead of night. He refused to abdicate, choosing instead to step into the void to prevent a civil war. Gazing out the glass as the Spanish countryside blurred into darkness, he faced the cruel symmetry of his existence. The boy who was born a king, without ever being a prince, would die a lonely exile.
All that remained was a dusty crown resting on a velvet cushion, a silent relic of a man who outlived his own era.